Hey there, where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments below. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. If you're enjoying this story, smash that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible tales. Now, let's dive into a story that will shake you to your core. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Lincoln Park brownstone, casting golden rectangles across the marble kitchen island where Charles Whitmore sat with his coffee and the Wall Street Journal. At 42, he had everything a successful investment banker could want. A thriving portfolio management firm, a stunning wife, and a life that looked perfect from every angle. But perfection, Charles was about to discover, was nothing more than an elaborate illusion. It started with a piece of crumpled paper. The night before, while searching for his wife Emma's car keys to move her BMW from the driveway, Charles had found something wedged between the driver's seat and center console. A business card, weathered and creased, with simple black text, Joe Miller, followed by a Chicago phone number with a 773 area code. Charles turned the card over in his fingers now, studying it like a puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere in his meticulously ordered life. After 12 years of marriage, he thought he knew everyone in Emma's world. Her yoga instructor Sarah, her book club friends, her colleagues from the art gallery where she worked part-time. But Joe Miller, the name meant nothing to him. More coffee. Emma's voice floated across the kitchen, honey-sweet as always. Charles looked up to find his wife of 12 years standing by the espresso machine, her auburn hair catching the morning light. At 38, Emma still took his breath away. The same emerald eyes that had captivated him at that gallery opening in River North. The same graceful movements that had made him fall in love at first sight. Actually, Emma, Charles set down his newspaper and held up the card. I found something interesting in your car last night. The change in Emma was instantaneous and unmistakable. Her face went pale, her hand trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot, and for just a moment, her eyes held the look of a deer caught in headlights. Where did you find that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Between your seat cushions. Who's Joe Miller? Emma moved to the kitchen island, her movements suddenly careful and measured. Joe Miller, he's connected to a project I've been working on, a charity thing. What kind of charity? Charles's banker instincts kicked in, the same instincts that had made him millions by detecting inconsistencies in financial statements. Something about Emma's tone set off alarm bells in his head. It's called the Hope Foundation, Emma said, not meeting his eyes. We're trying to set up programs for underprivileged kids in the South Side. Charles pulled out his phone and typed quickly. That's interesting because I don't see any Hope Foundation listed for Chicago. He looked up at his wife. Are you sure that's the name? Emma's hands fluttered to her hair, a nervous gesture Charles had rarely seen in their marriage. Maybe it's not officially incorporated yet. Joe handles most of the administrative stuff. And how exactly do you know Joe? Through someone at the gallery. The lie came out stilted, unnatural. Emma had always been a terrible liar, which was one of the reasons Charles had trusted her so completely. The grandfather clock in their foyer chimed 8 times, and Emma practically jumped at the sound. Oh God, I'm late for my appointment, she said, grabbing her purse and keys with suspicious urgency. We can talk about this later, okay? Before Charles could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone with his coffee, his newspaper, and a growing certainty that the woman he'd shared his life with for over a decade had just lied straight to his face. But the question that would haunt him for the rest of the day wasn't what Emma was hiding. It was how long she had been hiding it. That evening, Charles arrived home from his office in the Loop to find Emma in their living room, sitting rigidly on the edge of their white leather sofa. The television was off, the room silent except for the tick of their antique mantel clock. She looked like she was waiting for an execution. How was your appointment? Charles asked, loosening his Hermes tie as he studied his wife's face. Fine, just routine stuff. Emma's eyes darted to her phone, which had been buzzing intermittently since Charles walked in. Nothing important. The phone buzzed again. Charles nodded toward it. Seems like someone really wants to talk to you. Emma glanced at the screen and quickly flipped the phone face down. It's probably just spam calls. But Charles had seen enough. The caller ID had shown a name. Joe Miller. Emma. Charles's voice carried the same authoritative tone he used in board meetings. I need you to be honest with me. Who is Joe Miller? His wife's composure began to crack like ice under pressure. Her hands twisted in her lap, and when she looked up at him there were tears gathering in her green eyes. "Charles, please, I can't. If I tell you the truth, you'll hate me. Try me." Emma stood and walked to their picture window, gazing out at the tree-lined street where their neighbor's brownstones stood like silent sentinels. "Joe he's helping me with something personal, something I should have told you about years ago." "What kind of personal?" "I can't explain without—" She turned back to him, and Charles was struck by how small she looked in their expansive living room. "Without revealing things that will change how you see me." Charles felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. "Are you having an affair?" "No." The response came fast and sharp. "God, no, Charles, it's not like that." "Then what is it like?" Emma's phone buzzed again. This time Charles reached for it before she could stop him. "Joe Miller," flashed on the screen. "Answer it," Charles said, holding out the phone. "On speaker." "I can't do that." "Why not?" "Because—" Emma's voice broke. "Because you'll understand everything. And then you'll know that I've been lying to you about who I really am since the day we met." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that had been burning unseen for years. Charles stared at his wife, this woman he thought he knew better than anyone in the world, and realized he was looking at a complete stranger. Outside, the streetlights flickered on as darkness settled over Lincoln Park. But inside their perfect home, Charles felt like he was already living in the shadows. "Emma," he said quietly, "what have you done?" But she was already walking toward the stairs, leaving him alone with questions that seemed to multiply by the minute, and a phone that continued to buzz with calls from a man who apparently knew his wife better than he did. For the next 3 days, Charles Whitmore became a man he didn't recognize, a spy in his own marriage. It started small. He began noticing things about Emma that had always been there but somehow invisible to him. The way she never talked about her childhood friends, how she changed the subject whenever he suggested visiting her family in Naperville. The fact that in 12 years of marriage, he'd only met her mother twice, brief, awkward encounters where the older woman seemed nervous and out of place in their Lincoln Park home. Tuesday morning brought the first concrete evidence that Emma's deception ran deeper than one mysterious phone number. "I need to run to Whole Foods," Emma announced over breakfast, gathering her purse and keys. "We're almost out of everything." Charles nodded absently, but made a mental note of the time. 1:47 p.m. Emma returned at 5:52 p.m. with no groceries and a story about how the store had been closed for emergency maintenance. A quick Google search revealed that Whole Foods had been open all day, with no reported maintenance issues. Wednesday's lie was even more brazen. "Salon appointment," Emma called out as she headed for the door at 2:15 p.m. "Getting my roots touched up." She came back 4.5 hours later with identical hair. Same color, same style, same everything. When Charles commented that the salon had done a subtle job, Emma's face flushed red, and she mumbled something about the colorist being very natural. Thursday was the breaking point. Emma left at exactly 2 p.m., claiming she had to pick up dry cleaning and maybe grab lunch with Sarah. But Charles had spoken to Sarah the day before at their mutual friend's birthday party, and Sarah mentioned being swamped with a work project all week, eating lunch at her desk every day. That evening, as Emma sat at their kitchen island pretending to read a magazine while checking her phone every 30 seconds, Charles made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. He was going to follow his wife. The plan came together with the methodical precision Charles brought to his most complex financial deals. He would need a disguise. Emma knew his car, his clothes, his habits better than anyone. He would need to be invisible. Friday morning, while Emma was in their home gym, Charles made his preparations. He drove to a discount store in a neighborhood where none of their friends would ever shop and bought clothes he would never normally wear: a faded Bulls t-shirt, worn jeans, a baseball cap and cheap sunglasses. He borrowed his brother Michael's Honda Civic, telling him his BMW was in the shop. Most importantly, he downloaded the Uber driver app. If Emma was taking the CTA to wherever she was really going, the best way to follow without being detected was to hide in plain sight. As just another rideshare driver in the city, he would be completely invisible. By Friday afternoon, Charles was parked outside their brownstone in his borrowed car, wearing his disguise, waiting for Emma to make her 2 p.m. departure. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he watched his wife of 12 years walk out of their front door, down the stone steps, and toward the Lincoln Park CTA station. For the first time in his adult life, Charles Whitmore was about to discover what it felt like to be someone else entirely, and what he would learn about Emma, and about himself, would change everything he thought he knew about love, truth, and the price of living a lie. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and neither of them was prepared for what came next. Saturday morning found Charles sitting in his brother Michael's kitchen in Lakeview, nursing his second cup of coffee and fighting off the strangest case of nerves he'd experienced since his first big client presentation 15 years ago. "How you look like hell," Michael observed, leaning against the counter in his weekend uniform of flannel pajama pants and a Northwestern University sweatshirt. "Emma kick you out or something?" Something like that. Charles couldn't tell his younger brother the truth, that he suspected his wife of living a double life, and that he was planning to spy on her like something out of a Hollywood thriller. It sounded insane, even in his own head. "Well, you can crash here as long as you need to," Michael said. "Just don't reorganize my spice rack alphabetically like you did last time." Despite everything, Charles smiled. Michael had always been the laid-back Whitmore brother, content with his job as a high school history teacher, while Charles climbed the corporate ladder. But right now, Charles envied his brother's simple, honest life. After Michael left for his weekend soccer league, Charles spread out his surveillance materials on the kitchen table, like a general planning a military campaign. The cheap clothes he'd bought were laid out and ready. He'd studied Emma's patterns obsessively. Every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 2 p.m., she left their house and took the Red Line south toward downtown, then switched to the Green Line heading west toward the South Side. The South Side. Charles had lived in Chicago his entire adult life, but he'd barely set foot in that part of the city. His world existed in a carefully curated bubble: Lincoln Park, the Loop, River North, maybe Lakeview for dinner. The South Side might as well have been another planet. But that's where Emma went twice a week, like clockwork, to do something she couldn't tell her husband about. Charles changed into his disguise, studying himself in Michael's bathroom mirror. The transformation was startling. Without his tailored suits, his perfectly styled hair and his confident posture, he looked like any one of millions of working-class Chicago residents. Anonymous, invisible, perfect. His Uber driver application had been approved Friday evening. Apparently, his clean driving record and lack of criminal background made him an ideal candidate. He'd printed out the small placard with the Uber logo and his fake driver name, Dave Thompson. Emma would never recognize him. By 1:30 p.m., Charles was parked outside their brownstone in the borrowed Honda, watching their front door with the intensity of a detective on a stakeout. His heart hammered against his ribs as he wondered what he was about to discover. At exactly 1:58 p.m., Emma emerged from their house, wearing jeans and a simple sweater, clothes Charles rarely saw her in. She usually dressed more formally, even for casual errands, but this Emma looked different, younger, more authentic somehow. Charles followed at a distance as she walked to the Lincoln Park station and disappeared down the stairs to the Red Line platform. He drove quickly to the Howard station, knowing Emma would have to transfer at Fullerton. If he positioned himself right, he could intercept her there. The plan worked flawlessly. Charles was waiting in the rideshare pickup area at Fullerton when Emma emerged from the station 20 minutes later, looking around for transportation options. This was it, the moment of truth. Charles rolled down his passenger window and called out in a slightly different voice than his usual polished tone. "Need a ride? I'm Dave, your Uber driver." Emma approached the car, checking her phone to confirm the pickup. "Going to the South Side," she said, as she slid into the back seat. "Specifically 3247 South Ashland." Charles nodded and pulled into traffic, his hands slightly trembling on the steering wheel. His wife was sitting 3 feet behind him, and she had no idea who was driving her car. "First time in that neighborhood?" Charles asked, trying to sound like casual Dave Thompson and not like Charles Whitmore, investment banker and concerned husband. "No," Emma replied, and Charles caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in days, she looked relaxed. "I go there pretty regularly. It's where I grew up, actually." The words hit Charles like a physical blow. Emma had grown up in Naperville, in an affluent suburb 40 miles west of Chicago. She'd told him dozens of stories about her childhood home, her mother's garden, the country club where she'd learned to play tennis. But now she was saying she'd grown up in the South Side? Charles gripped the steering wheel tighter and tried to keep his voice steady. Really, that's cool. What's it like going back to the old neighborhood? In the rearview mirror, he saw Emma's face transform. The careful mask she wore at home, the polished, put-together expression of a successful gallery worker, married to a wealthy banker, melted away. In its place was something raw and real. "It's complicated," she said softly. "There are people there who knew me before I became who I am now. Sometimes I wonder if I was happier then." Charles felt like he was watching his entire marriage dissolve in real time. But the real shock was yet to come. As they drove south through the city, Charles watched Chicago transform outside his windows. The gleaming towers of downtown gave way to older neighborhoods, then to areas he'd only seen from the highway. Blocks of small houses, corner stores with signs in Spanish, playgrounds where kids played despite the October chill. Emma sat quietly in the back seat for most of the journey, occasionally giving directions but mostly just staring out the window with the expression Charles had never seen before. She looked like someone returning home after a long journey. They were stopped at a red light on Ashland Avenue when Emma's phone rang. "Joe?" she answered without looking at the caller ID. "Yeah, I'm about 5 minutes away." Charles's entire body went rigid. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading and anticipating for days. He was about to hear his wife talk to the mysterious Joe Miller, and she had no idea her husband was listening to every word. "No, I still haven't told him," Emma said, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. I know, I promised I would, but Joe, you don't understand how hard this is." The light turned green and Charles drove slowly, straining to catch every word while trying to appear like he wasn't listening. "It's not that simple. Charles has certain expectations about people, about backgrounds. I've been living this lie for so long I don't know how to tell him the truth about where I really come from." Charles felt his world tilt on its axis. Whatever this was about, it wasn't an affair. It was about Emma's past, about who she really was. "I'm scared, okay?" Emma's voice cracked slightly. "I'm scared that when he finds out I've been lying about practically everything about my life, he'll realize he doesn't actually love the real me. He loves this version of me I created." The words cut through Charles like a blade. His wife was afraid he wouldn't love the real her. What did that say about him as a husband? "No, Mum's condition is getting worse," Emma continued, and Charles nearly swerved into the next lane. "Mum, Emma's mother lived in Naperville, not the South Side. The doctors want to try a more aggressive treatment, but the insurance won't cover it. I've been paying out of pocket, but Charles doesn't know. If he asks where the money went, I don't know what I'll tell him." Charles pulled over to the curb, his hands shaking. Emma thought her mother lived in Naperville, but here she was talking about treatments and insurance like her mother was sick and nearby. "I know you think I should just tell him everything," Emma said. "But Joe, what if he can't handle it? What if he looks at me differently when he knows where I really come from? What if he's ashamed of me?" The conversation ended just as Charles pulled up to 3247 South Ashland, a small, well-maintained house with a tiny front yard and flowers in window boxes. It wasn't the kind of place Charles would normally notice, but now he studied every detail like it held the secrets to his marriage. "This is perfect, Dave. Thank you so much," Emma said as she got out of the car. "No problem. Have a good visit with your friend," Charles replied, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Emma paused with her hand on the door handle and looked back at him. For a terrifying moment, Charles thought she'd recognized him, but then she just smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in weeks. "Yeah, I will." Charles watched his wife walk up to the front door of the little house. A man answered, mid-50s, graying hair, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. But as Charles studied the interaction between Emma and this Joe Miller, he realized something that should have been a relief, but somehow made everything more complicated. These two people weren't lovers. The way they greeted each other, the comfortable familiarity, the lack of romantic tension, it was obvious to anyone watching that Joe Miller wasn't Emma's secret boyfriend. He was something else entirely. Something that Emma was so ashamed of, she'd been lying about it for 12 years. As Charles drove away from the South Side, his mind raced with questions that seemed to multiply by the minute. Who was Joe Miller? Why had Emma lied about where her mother lived? What treatment was she paying for? And most importantly, who was the real Emma Whitmore? By the time he reached Michael's apartment, Charles had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. He was going back. And next time, he was going to find out the truth about his wife's secret life, even if it destroyed everything he thought he knew about their marriage. Because living with lies, Charles was beginning to understand, was no way to live at all. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. Charles had spent 3 days analyzing every word of Emma's phone conversation like it was a complex financial statement, looking for clues to decode his wife's secret life. The most troubling piece was Emma's reference to her mother being sick and needing expensive treatments. Charles had always been puzzled by how rarely Emma visited her mother in Naperville, especially since they were supposedly close. Now he was beginning to suspect that Emma's mother didn't live in Naperville at all. She lived somewhere near the south side, possibly even in the house at 3247 South Ashland. This time, Charles was prepared for a longer surveillance operation. He'd brought binoculars, a thermos of coffee, and a notebook to record everything he observed. He parked the Honda 2 blocks away from the Ashland Avenue house and walked back, finding a coffee shop with a perfect view of the front door. At 2:47 p.m., Emma arrived via CTA just as she had on Tuesday. Charles watched through the coffee shop window as she approached the house with the familiarity of someone who'd made this journey countless times. But this time, Charles could see more clearly what happened when she knocked on the door. The man who answered, Joe Miller, didn't just greet Emma. He hugged her warmly, like family, like someone who'd known her for years, not months. And when Emma stepped inside, Charles caught a glimpse of the interior, family photos on the walls, comfortable furniture that looked lived in rather than decorated, the warm glow of a home rather than a showplace. It was nothing like the carefully curated aesthetic of their Lincoln Park brownstone. Charles spent the next 2 hours nursing 2 cups of coffee and watching the house. At 4:15, a CTA bus pulled up and a woman in her 30s got off, carrying grocery bags. She had the same auburn hair as Emma, the same graceful walk. When she knocked on the door of 3247 South Ashland, Emma herself answered. Sisters? Charles leaned forward, studying the interaction through his binoculars. The 2 women embraced like family, talking animatedly as they brought the groceries inside. At 4:43, another arrival, a man in a CTA uniform, a bus driver from the look of his clothes, who pulled up in an older Ford pickup truck. Again, Emma answered the door. Again, the warm family greeting. Charles felt like an anthropologist studying an alien civilization. This wasn't the Emma he knew, the polished gallery worker who attended charity galas and discussed contemporary art with their Lincoln Park neighbors. This was someone else entirely, a woman who seemed completely at home in a working-class neighborhood, who had family members with blue-collar jobs, who belonged to a world Charles had never even glimpsed. The final piece of the puzzle arrived at 5:22 p.m., an elderly woman being helped from a taxi by yet another man Charles didn't recognize. This woman moved slowly, carefully, like someone recovering from illness. She was thin, wearing a headscarf that suggested recent chemotherapy treatments. When Emma opened the door this time, her face transformed with joy and concern. She helped the older woman inside with the tenderness of a daughter caring for her mother. Charles lowered his binoculars, his hands shaking slightly. That woman wasn't Emma's mother. According to everything Emma had told him, her mother was a healthy, affluent woman living in a Naperville suburb. But the love and care in Emma's face was unmistakable. Someone was lying. Either Emma had been deceiving him about her mother for 12 years, or this was an elaborate performance for someone else's benefit. But watching Emma through that window, Charles knew with absolute certainty which explanation was true. As the sun began to set over the south side, casting long shadows across Ashland Avenue, Charles made his way back to the Honda with a head full of questions and a heart full of dread. His wife had created an entirely fictional version of her life. But why? What was so terrible about her real family that she'd felt compelled to invent a new one? And what would happen to their marriage when Emma discovered that her husband had been spying on her? Charles drove north toward Lincoln Park, knowing that tomorrow he would have to decide. Confront Emma with what he'd learned, or continue living in the shadow world of half-truths and surveillance that his marriage had become. Either choice felt like it might destroy them both. Friday afternoon, Charles found himself back in the Honda, back in his Dave Thompson disguise, waiting outside the Fullerton CTA station for Emma to emerge. He'd barely slept the night before, his mind churning with images from the house on Ashland Avenue and questions that seemed to have no good answers. This time he was determined to hear more of Emma's story. Whatever secret she was keeping, it was eating away at their marriage from the inside out. Emma appeared at 2:52 p.m., looking tired and worried in a way Charles rarely saw. When she got into the back seat of his car, he could see stress lines around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite cover. "Same destination?" Charles asked in his Dave Thompson voice. "Yes, please. 3247 South Ashland." Emma settled back in her seat, already reaching for her phone. "And thank you for being available on such short notice again. It's been a difficult week." As they drove south, Charles found himself studying his wife in the rearview mirror with new eyes. Without the armor of her Lincoln Park persona, the designer clothes, the perfect makeup, the carefully controlled expressions, she looked younger and more vulnerable, more real. They were passing through Bronzeville when Emma's phone rang. "Mom," she answered, and Charles's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "How are you feeling today?" There it was, confirmation of what Charles had suspected since Thursday. Emma's mother wasn't living in comfortable retirement in Naperville. She was sick, possibly seriously ill, and living somewhere on the south side of Chicago. "I know the new medication is expensive," Emma continued, her voice soft with worry. "Don't think about that. I've got it covered." Charles wanted to scream. For 12 years he'd been managing their family finances, while Emma supposedly contributed her gallery salary. But if she was paying for expensive medical treatments, where was that money coming from? "No, I still haven't told Charles about you," Emma said, and Charles felt his heart stop. "Mom, you don't understand. He comes from a completely different world. His family has money going back generations. They've never had to worry about anything we've worried about." Charles thought about his own upbringing. Private schools, summer homes, college without student loans, a trust fund that had made his early career possible. Emma was right. He'd never worried about money the way other people did. But was that really why she'd hidden her family from him? "I know you want to meet him properly," Emma continued. "And I want that too. But I'm scared, Mom. What if he looks at our house, at our neighborhood, at the way we live, and realizes he made a mistake marrying me?" The words hit Charles like a physical blow. Emma thought he would be ashamed of her real family. What kind of man had he been to make her feel that way? "The doctor called this morning," Emma said, her voice breaking slightly. "The treatment is working. The tumors are shrinking." Cancer. Emma's mother had cancer, and Emma had been dealing with this alone rather than trust her husband with the truth. "I love you too, Mom. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Emma hung up and wiped her eyes quickly, probably thinking her Uber driver wouldn't notice. But Charles noticed everything now. The way his wife carried burdens he didn't even know existed, the way she protected him from truths she thought he couldn't handle. When they pulled up to 3247 South Ashland, Emma sat in the back seat for a moment longer than usual. "Dave?" she said softly. "Yeah? Do you think it's possible to love someone so much that you lie to them to protect them, even if the lies end up hurting more than the truth would have?" Charles met her eyes in the rearview mirror, and for a moment he almost broke character. His wife was asking for absolution for sins she'd committed out of love, and he was the only one who could grant it. "I think," Charles said carefully, "that people usually lie because they're afraid, and fear makes us do things we wouldn't normally do." Emma nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's exactly right." She got out of the car and walked toward the house where her real family was waiting, the family she thought her husband couldn't accept, the mother she was caring for in secret, the life she'd hidden for 12 years because she loved Charles too much to risk losing him. As Charles drove away from Ashland Avenue for the second time, he realized that everything he thought he knew about his marriage had been wrong. Emma wasn't the deceiver in their relationship. She was the protector, and he was the man she felt she needed to protect herself from. That night, Charles sat in their Lincoln Park living room, staring at the business card that had started everything. Joe Miller's name and phone number seemed to mock him from the small piece of paper. In less than a week, that card had unraveled 12 years of marriage and revealed that the woman he'd pledged his life to was a complete stranger. Or was she? The more Charles thought about Emma's secret life, the more he realized that the woman he'd fallen in love with hadn't disappeared. She'd just been carefully edited. The kindness, the compassion, the way she always chose the modest restaurant over the expensive one, her preference for staying home over attending charity galas, her uncomfortable reaction whenever he made casual comments about those people in less affluent neighborhoods. It all made sense now. Emma hadn't been different from who he'd married. She'd been more herself than he'd ever allowed her to be. But understanding didn't make the betrayal hurt less. 12 years of lies, even well-intentioned ones, had created a chasm between them that Charles didn't know how to cross. Emma came home at 7:30 p.m. looking drained and sad. She found Charles in the living room and sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap like a child waiting for punishment. "How's your mother?" Charles asked quietly. Emma's face went white. "What? Your mother? In Naperville? How is she doing?" She's fine. Why do you ask?" Charles held up his phone, showing Google Maps with a location pin at 3247 South Ashland Avenue. "Because I know that's not where you've been going twice a week, and I know Joe Miller isn't some charity contact." Emma stared at the phone screen like it was a bomb that might explode at any moment. When she looked back at Charles, tears were streaming down her face. "How long have you known?" she whispered. "A week, since I found Joe's card." Charles set his phone aside and leaned forward. "Emma, I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Who is Joe Miller? Where is your real mother? And why have you been lying to me about your family for 12 years? For a long moment, Emma just cried. Not the delicate tears of someone trying to maintain their composure, but the broken sobs of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around them. "I can't," she finally managed. "Charles, if I tell you the truth, you'll leave me. If you don't tell me the truth, I'll leave you anyway." The words hung in the air between them like a sword. Emma looked up at her husband with red-rimmed eyes, and Charles saw something he'd never seen before. Absolute terror. "My mother's name is Mary Dolores Kowalski," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "She's 65 years old and she has lung cancer. She lives at 3247 South Ashland Avenue in a house my father bought in 1987 for $38,000. She worked as a cleaning lady for 40 years, mostly in office buildings downtown." Charles felt like he was hearing about a completely different person. "My father's name was John. He was a construction worker who died when I was 16. We couldn't afford the funeral home we wanted, so we buried him at Graceland Cemetery in a plot that cost us our savings account." Each word felt like a revelation and a betrayal simultaneously. "I have 4 siblings. Mark drives a bus for the CTA. Lucy works at a factory in Cicero. David is a mechanic. Natalie is a nurse's aide at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Joe Miller is my uncle, my father's brother. He's been taking care of Mum since Dad died, making sure she gets to her doctor appointments and helping her with the house." Emma stood up and walked to their picture window, looking out at the tree-lined street where their neighbors lived lives of quiet affluence. "I grew up in a neighborhood where gunshots weren't unusual. I worked 3 jobs to pay for community college, then transferred to UIC, where I worked in the cafeteria to pay tuition. I've never been to a country club, never played tennis, never had a trust fund or family money or any of the things I told you I had." Charles sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of Emma's deception. "When I met you at that gallery opening 12 years ago, I was working there as a security guard, not as an employee. I was wearing a borrowed dress because I couldn't afford anything nice enough for that event. But you looked at me like I was the most beautiful woman in the room, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere special." Emma turned back to face him, her face streaked with tears. "So I lied. About everything. My background, my education, my family, my job. I created a version of myself I thought you could love. And every year that passed, the lie got bigger and harder to tell the truth about." Charles stared at his wife, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. "Emma, I know you hate me," she said quickly. "I know this changes everything. But Charles, I need you to understand I didn't lie because I wanted to trick you. I lied because I loved you so much. I couldn't bear the thought of you being ashamed of me." The room fell silent except for the tick of their mantel clock and the sound of Emma's quiet crying. Charles looked at this woman he'd shared his life with for over a decade and realized he was finally meeting her for the first time. The question now was whether their marriage could survive the introduction. The next Saturday, Charles found himself walking up to 3247 South Ashland Avenue with Emma beside him. both of them nervous for entirely different reasons. "Are you sure about this?" Emma asked for the fifth time as they approached the front door. "Because if you change your mind after meeting them, I don't know if I can handle it." Charles squeezed her hand. "I'm sure." But he wasn't sure of anything anymore. 3 days had passed since Emma's confession. 3 days of difficult conversations, tears and tentative steps toward rebuilding their marriage on a foundation of truth instead of carefully constructed fiction. The door opened before they could knock, revealing Joe Miller, the man whose business card had started this entire journey. Up close, Charles could see the family resemblance to Emma in his eyes and smile. "You must be Charles," Joe said, extending a weathered hand. "I'm Joe, Emma's uncle. We've heard a lot about you." "Nice to finally meet you," Charles replied and meant it. The interior of the house was nothing like Charles had expected. While small, it was immaculately clean and filled with the kind of warmth their Lincoln Park brownstone had never achieved. Family photos covered every surface. Emma as a child with missing teeth, graduation pictures, wedding photos, grandchildren Charles had never known existed. "Mom!" Emma called out. "We're here." An elderly woman emerged from what Charles assumed was the kitchen, moving slowly but with dignity. This was Mary Dolores Kowalski, the woman Emma had been calling her mother in secret phone conversations, the woman whose cancer treatments Emma had been financing without her husband's knowledge. "Charles," Mary said, her voice carrying a slight Polish accent that explained Emma's occasional pronunciation quirks Charles had never questioned. "I'm so happy to finally meet you properly." Charles took her thin hands in his, struck by how different this felt from the awkward encounters with Emma's supposed mother in Naperville. This woman looked at him with genuine warmth, not the nervous politeness he remembered from those earlier meetings. "Mrs. Kowalski, I'm honored to meet you. Emma talks about you all the time." Mary's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Does she?" "Because she's been telling me for months that you don't even know I exist." The honesty was refreshing after years of careful conversations full of half-truths. "Mom," Emma said, her face reddening. "What? It's true. Sit down, both of you. I made pierogi." Over the next hour, Charles met the rest of Emma's real family as they arrived for what was clearly a regular Saturday gathering. Mark, the CTA bus driver, showed up first with his wife Patricia and their twin boys. Lucy came next with her husband and teenage daughter. David arrived last, apologizing for being late because he'd been working on a neighbor's car. What struck Charles most was how naturally Emma fit into this group. The careful, controlled woman he knew from Lincoln Park disappeared completely, replaced by someone who laughed easily, teased her brothers mercilessly, and helped her mother in the kitchen without being asked. "She always was the smart one," Mark told Charles as they watched Emma help Mary serve dinner. "First one in the family to go to college. We were all so proud when she got that job at the gallery. Even if she did have to lie about where she came from to get it," Lucy added with a pointed look at her sister. "Lucy," Mary warned. "What?" "It's true, Ma. Emma's been pretending to be someone else for so long. I sometimes wonder if she remembers who she really is." Charles looked around the table at this loud, honest, loving family and understood something fundamental about his wife that he'd missed for 12 years. Emma hadn't been lying about who she was. She'd been hiding who she was, and the person she'd been hiding was extraordinary. "Mrs. Kowalski," Charles said during a lull in the conversation, "Emma told me about your illness. How are you doing with the treatments?" The table went quiet. Mary looked at Emma, who nodded slightly. "The cancer is responding well to chemotherapy," Mary said. "The doctors are optimistic, but the treatments are expensive, even with insurance." "Mom, don't worry about that," Emma said quickly. "Actually," Charles said, looking at his wife, "I'd like to help. With the medical bills, I mean, if that's okay with everyone." Emma stared at him across the table. "Charles, you don't have to." "I want to. She's family." Mary Kowalski reached across the table and took Charles's hand. "You're a good man, Charles Whitmore. My daughter chose well." As the evening wound down and Charles found himself helping clear dishes in the tiny kitchen, he realized something profound. This house felt more like home than his Lincoln Park brownstone ever had. "What are you thinking?" Emma asked, appearing beside him with a stack of plates. "I'm thinking," Charles said carefully, "that I understand why you were afraid to tell me the truth, but I wish you had trusted me enough to try." Emma set down the plates and turned to face him. Do you really understand? Charles looked out the kitchen window at the south side street where his wife had grown up, then back at the woman who had loved him enough to reinvent herself completely. I'm beginning to, he said. And Emma? I'm sorry it took me so long to meet your real family. They're wonderful. For the first time since their world had turned upside down, Emma smiled at him without reservation. Yeah, she said, they really are. But as they drove back to Lincoln Park that night, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that understanding Emma's deception was only the beginning. The real work of rebuilding their marriage was just getting started. Monday morning found Charles sitting in his corner office on the 34th floor of a loop skyscraper, staring out at the city spread below him and seeing it with completely different eyes. From this height, Chicago looked like an intricate map divided into clear sections. The gleaming towers of downtown where he spent his days, the elegant neighborhoods of Lincoln Park and Gold Coast where he lived, and beyond them, the sprawling south and west sides where people like Emma's family built their lives. For 42 years, Charles had moved effortlessly through only one section of that map. His assistant knocked on his door, interrupting his thoughts. Mr. Whitmore? The cleaning crew is here for your office. Send them in, Charles said absently. Two women entered with their cart of supplies, and Charles looked up from his computer to acknowledge them, something he realized with shame that he rarely did. The older woman looked to be about Mary Kowalski's age, with the same careful dignity Emma's mother carried. Good morning, Charles said, really looking at her for the first time. I'm sorry, I don't think we've been introduced. I'm Charles. The woman looked surprised. Oh, I'm Maria, Mr. Whitmore. I've been cleaning your office for 3 years. 3 years. Charles had passed this woman dozens of times, and he'd never bothered to learn her name. It's nice to meet you, Maria. And please call me Charles. As Maria and her colleague worked, Charles found himself paying attention to details he'd never noticed before. The efficiency of their movements, the care they took with his belongings, the quiet professionalism they brought to work that was largely invisible to people like him. Work that was exactly like what Mary Kowalski had done for 40 years to support her family. When they finished, Charles made an impulse decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. Maria, could I ask you something? Do you have family? Yes, sir. 3 children and 2 grandchildren. What do your children do? Maria's face lit up with pride. My oldest son is a teacher. My daughter works at Northwestern Hospital as a technician. My youngest is in college, studying engineering. Charles felt a familiar tightness in his chest. That's wonderful. You must be very proud. I am. They work hard like I taught them. After Maria left, Charles sat at his desk thinking about Emma's family, about the pride in Mary Kowalski's eyes when she talked about her children, about the way Emma had hidden her own hard-working background because she thought Charles would find it shameful. What kind of man had he been to make her feel that way? The answer came to him with uncomfortable clarity. He'd been exactly the kind of man who didn't learn his cleaning lady's name in 3 years. That afternoon, Charles made his first concrete change. He called his HR director. Janet, I want to review our employee benefits package. Specifically, I want to know why our maintenance and cleaning staff don't receive the same health insurance as everyone else. Well, they're contractors, not full employees. I want them to be full employees, with full benefits. Can you make that happen? There was a pause. Charles, that's going to be expensive. I don't care what it costs. These people work as hard as anyone else in this building. They deserve the same protections. It was a small step, but it felt significant. That evening, Charles arrived home to find Emma in their kitchen, making dinner with the same careful attention to detail she brought to everything. But now he noticed things he'd missed before. How she never wasted food, how she automatically turned off lights when leaving a room, how she mended small tears in clothing instead of replacing items, the habits of someone who had grown up with less. How was your day? Emma asked, not looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. Different, Charles said. I learned the name of our office cleaning lady, Maria. She has 3 children. Emma's hands stilled on the knife. That's nice. Emma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. She turned to face him, worry creasing her features. How many times have I said or done things that made you feel ashamed of your family? The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Emma set down the knife and leaned against the counter, her shoulders sagging. Charles, tell me, please. Emma was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Remember our third date? We drove past a construction site, and you made a comment about those people not knowing how to work efficiently. My father was a construction worker." Charles felt sick. Or the time we were stuck in traffic behind a CTA bus, and you complained about public transportation being for people who couldn't afford real transportation. Mark has been driving buses for 15 years. Each example was a knife twist of recognition. Charles remembered those moments, remembered the casual superiority he'd felt, the thoughtless assumptions he'd made. "I never said those things to hurt you," Charles said weakly. "I know. That's what made them hurt so much. You weren't being cruel. You were just being honest about how you saw the world, about how you saw people like my family." Emma moved to the sink and began washing the vegetables with unnecessary focus. "Every time you complained about the cost of your housekeeper, I thought about my mother scrubbing office floors until her knees gave out. Every time you criticized someone's grammar or accent, I heard my own voice when I was tired and forgot to speak like someone from Naperville." Charles walked over to his wife and gently turned her to face him. "Emma, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I made you feel like you had to hide who you were." "I know you are," she said softly. "But Charles, it's not just about apologies. If we're going to make this work, if we're going to build something real, I need to know that you can love all of me, not just the parts that fit comfortably into your world." Charles looked at this woman who had sacrificed her own identity for 12 years to be with him, and realized that the question wasn't whether he could love the real Emma. The question was whether he could become the kind of man who deserved her. "I want to try," he said. "I want to be better than I've been." Emma searched his eyes for something. Sincerity, commitment, the possibility of real change. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's try." But as they stood in their perfect kitchen, in their perfect house, both of them understood that wanting to change and actually changing were two very different things. The real test was still to come. 2 weeks later, Charles found himself doing something he'd never imagined. Sitting in Mary Kowalski's living room on a Tuesday evening, not as Emma's husband making a polite visit, but as someone who was genuinely learning to care about this family that had raised the woman he loved. "The doctors are pleased with how the treatments are going," Mary was telling him as Emma made tea in the kitchen. "The tumor markers are way down." "That's wonderful news," Charles said, and meant it. Over the past weeks, he'd been quietly handling Mary's medical bills, but more importantly, he'd been getting to know the woman whose strength had shaped Emma's character. "You know," Mary said, settling back in her favorite chair, "when Emma first started talking about you 12 years ago, I was worried." "Why?" "Because she started changing the way she talked about us, about this neighborhood, about herself. Like she was ashamed of where she came from." Charles felt the familiar pang of guilt. "She wasn't ashamed of you. She was afraid I'd be ashamed of her." Same thing in the end. Mary's directness was something Charles had learned to appreciate. Unlike the careful diplomacy of his usual social circle, Emma's family spoke with refreshing honesty. "Mrs. Kowalski, Mary, please. Mary, I need you to know that I never wanted Emma to feel that way. I was just ignorant about a lot of things." Mary studied him with the sharp eyes of someone who had worked for decades in buildings full of men like Charles. "The question isn't what you wanted then, it's what you're going to do now." Before Charles could respond, Emma returned with a tray of tea and homemade cookies. "What are you two conspiring about?" "Your husband is asking for my approval," Mary said with a slight smile. "Mom," Emma warned. "What? He is?" "And I told him approval has to be earned, not asked for." Charles had been earning that approval in small but significant ways. He'd changed his company's employment practices to provide full benefits for all workers. He'd started shopping at local businesses in Emma's neighborhood when he visited. He'd learned the names of every service worker in his office building and made an effort to acknowledge them as individuals rather than invisible help. But the biggest changes were happening at home. "Emma," Charles said as they drove back to Lincoln Park that evening, "I've been thinking about something." What if we invited your mother to stay with us for a while, during her treatments?" Emma nearly swerved into the next lane. "What? She's making that long trip to Northwestern Memorial 3 times a week for chemotherapy. It would be easier if she didn't have to travel from the South Side every time." "Charles, you don't understand. My mother isn't like your parents. She's not going to fit into our world." Then maybe we need to change our world. Emma pulled into their driveway and turned off the engine but didn't get out of the car. You're serious about this? I'm serious about you. About us. About doing this right this time. That weekend, Charles and Emma spent Saturday moving Mary Kowalski into their guest room, a room that had previously been used only for Charles's parents' occasional visits and Emma's fictional mother from Naperville. The transformation of their house was immediate and profound. Mary brought life to spaces that had been perfectly decorated, but somehow empty. She cooked meals that filled their kitchen with actual warmth, instead of just the appearance of it. She asked Emma about her day with the genuine interest of someone who actually cared about the answers. Most importantly, she treated Charles with the straightforward affection of someone who had decided to accept him into her family, not because of his wealth or status, but because he was trying to be worthy of her daughter. "You know what I like about your house?" Mary said to Charles on her third evening there, as they sat in the living room after dinner. "What's that?" "It's finally starting to feel like Emma actually lives here." Charles looked around their living room, the same room where Emma had sat like a visitor for 12 years, careful not to disturb the perfect aesthetic with anything too personal. Now Mary's knitting basket sat beside the sofa, family photos from Ashland Avenue graced the mantel, and Emma moved through the space with the relaxed comfort of someone who didn't have to perform being someone else. "You're right," Charles said. "It does." On Sunday, the entire Kowalski family came for dinner, something that would have been unthinkable in the old version of Charles and Emma's marriage. Mark brought his boys, who played video games with an enthusiasm that would have horrified Charles's parents. Lucy and her family filled the formal dining room with laughter and arguments and the comfortable chaos of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. As Charles watched Emma at the head of their dining room table, completely herself for perhaps the first time in their house, he realized something profound. The woman he'd fallen in love with 12 years ago hadn't been the polished, careful version of Emma he'd been living with. It had been this Emma, the one who emerged when she felt safe to be exactly who she was. "What are you thinking about?" Emma asked later that night as they cleaned up together. "I'm thinking," Charles said, "that I wasted 12 years not knowing my own wife." Emma stopped loading the dishwasher and looked at him. "We both wasted those years, Charles. I was so busy being who I thought you wanted me to be, I forgot how to just be me. And now?" Emma smiled. The same smile that had captivated him at that gallery opening 12 years ago, but somehow more beautiful because it was completely real. "Now I remember," she said. But even as they stood in their kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable mess of a real family dinner, both Charles and Emma knew their journey wasn't over. Learning to live authentically after 12 years of careful fiction would require more than good intentions. It would require courage neither of them was sure they possessed. Spring came to Chicago with unexpected gentleness, and with it, a phone call that would test everything Charles and Emma had rebuilt over the past 6 months. Charles was in his office when his assistant buzzed him. "Mr. Whitmore, your wife is on line 1. She says it's urgent." "Emma, what's wrong?" "Charles, I need you to come to Northwestern Memorial immediately. It's Mom." The 30-minute drive from the Loop to the hospital felt like hours. Charles found Emma in the oncology waiting room, surrounded by her siblings, her face pale with worry. "What happened?" "She collapsed at home this morning," Mark said. "Joe found her when he came to check on her. They're running tests now." For the next 4 hours, the Kowalski family waited with the patient endurance of people who had learned not to expect the best from life, but to face whatever came with dignity. Charles found himself studying this family he'd become part of, noting how they supported each other without drama or performance. When Lucy started crying, David simply moved closer and put an arm around her shoulders. When Mark began pacing, Joe quietly took over the role of keeping everyone updated with the medical stuff, and Emma held them all together with the quiet strength Charles had never fully recognized when she was busy hiding it from him. At 6 p.m., Dr. Martinez emerged from the treatment area with news that would change everything. "The cancer has spread," she said, with the gentle directness of someone who delivered such news regularly. "We can continue with more aggressive treatments, but I need you to understand that we're now looking at palliative care, not curative treatment." The words hit the family like a physical blow. Emma closed her eyes and leaned against Charles, who found himself becoming the anchor for people who had been strangers to him 8 months earlier. "How long?" Mary's voice came from behind them. They turned to see her being wheeled toward them in a hospital wheelchair, thin but alert, her eyes clear despite the medication. "Mum, you should be resting," Emma started. "How long?" Mary repeated, looking directly at Dr. Martinez. "With treatment, possibly 6 to 8 months, maybe longer if you respond well. Without treatment, perhaps 2 to 3 months." Mary nodded calmly, as if the doctor had told her the weather forecast. "I want to go home." "Mum," Lucy began. "Not to argue about treatments or second opinions or any of that," Mary said firmly. "I want to go home and think about this with my family." That evening, they gathered in Charles and Emma's living room, the room that had been transformed over the months from a showplace into an actual family space. Mary sat in what had become her favorite chair, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, while Charles found himself occupying a role he never could have imagined, the son-in-law whose opinion actually mattered. "I've been thinking about what the doctor said," Mary began, "and I need to tell you all something. I don't want to spend whatever time I have left sick from treatments that might not work." "Ma, you can't give up," Mark protested. "I'm not giving up. I'm choosing how I want to live." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Charles had ever witnessed in his own family, where difficult topics were handled with careful euphemism and emotional distance. The Kowalskis talked about death, about fear, about love, about what mattered most in whatever time remained. And they included Charles in that conversation as if he'd been part of their family his entire life. "Charles," Mary said at one point, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course." "If I choose to stop the aggressive treatments, will you take care of Emma? Not financially. She's strong enough to take care of herself. But will you be there for her in the way she needs?" Charles looked at his wife, who was crying quietly, but listening intently to every word. "I will," he said. "I promise. And will you let her take care of you too? Because that girl has been carrying other people's burdens her whole life. She deserves someone who sees her strength, but doesn't take advantage of it." The question cut to the heart of everything that had been wrong in their marriage and everything they'd been working to fix. "I'm learning how to do that," Charles said. "Every day." Mary studied him with the shrewd assessment of someone who had spent decades reading people's true character. "Good," she said finally. "Because I'm going to spend whatever time I have left right here in this house with my family, all of my family." Over the following weeks, their Lincoln Park brownstone became something Charles had never experienced. A genuine home. Mary's presence transformed every room, not through decoration or design, but through the simple act of being someone who loved unconditionally and expected the same in return. Emma blossomed in ways Charles had never seen. Without the exhaustion of maintaining her fictional persona, she revealed depths of humor, intelligence and strength that had been hidden for years. She managed her mother's care with competent grace, while building a more honest relationship with her husband. And Charles discovered that the life he'd thought he wanted, perfectly ordered, predictably comfortable, socially acceptable, paled in comparison to the messy, complicated, deeply real life he was living now. But Mary's condition continued to deteriorate, and Charles found himself facing a question that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. How do you say goodbye to someone who taught you what family really means? The answer, he was learning, was that you don't say goodbye. You say thank you. August brought an unexpected heat wave to Chicago, but inside the brownstone on Lincoln Park West, the atmosphere was one of peaceful acceptance rather than the frantic energy that had characterized the spring months. Mary Kowalski was dying, and everyone knew it. But instead of the tragedy Charles had expected, he found himself witnessing something profound. A woman who had lived fully was teaching her family how to face the end of life with the same courage and dignity she'd brought to everything else. "Charles," Mary called to him one afternoon as he passed her room. "Come sit with me for a minute." He found her propped up in the hospital bed they'd installed by the window, looking out at the tree-lined street where children played in the late summer heat. "I want to talk to you about Emma." Charles settled into the chair beside her bed, the same chair where he'd spent countless hours over the past months, learning more about love and family than he'd absorbed in his previous 42 years. "She's stronger than you think," Mary continued. "Stronger than she thinks too sometimes. But she's also been taking care of everyone else for so long, she's forgotten how to let someone take care of her." I'm trying to learn how to do that. I know you are, but I need you to promise me something. Charles leaned forward. Anything. Don't let her go back to being that person she was pretending to be for all those years. That wasn't really Emma. That was Emma trying to be small enough to fit into what she thought your world required. The words hit Charles with the force of absolute truth. I won't. I promise. Mary reached for his hand, with fingers that had grown thin, but retained their strength. Good. Because the Emma I raised, the real Emma, is worth knowing. She's worth loving exactly as she is. That evening, Charles found Emma in their kitchen, methodically preparing dinner with the focused intensity she brought to tasks when she was trying not to think about something else. "How was your visit with Mom this afternoon?" she asked without looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. "Illuminating. She made me promise not to let you go back to pretending to be someone else after she's gone." Emma's hand stilled on the knife. "Charles, she's right, you know. For 12 years I was married to a performance, a beautiful, convincing performance, but not the real you." Emma set down the knife and turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't know how to be anyone else anymore. I've been performing for so long, I'm not sure I remember who the real me is." Charles moved closer, taking her hands in his. "I know who she is. Do you? She's the woman who worked 3 jobs to pay for college, who sent money home to help her family even when she could barely afford it herself, who paid for her mother's cancer treatments without ever making it seem like a sacrifice." Emma was crying now, but Charles continued. "She's the woman who fell in love with a man who didn't deserve her, and then spent 12 years trying to become someone she thought he could love, instead of teaching him how to love who she really was. Charles. She's the woman who's been taking care of everyone around her while pretending she didn't need taking care of herself. She's brave and kind and real in ways that terrify people who live in the artificial world I came from." Emma collapsed against him, and Charles held her while she cried, not the careful tears of someone trying to maintain composure, but the deep, cleansing sobs of someone finally allowing themselves to be vulnerable. "I don't want to lose her," Emma whispered against his shoulder. "I know. Neither do I." They stood together in their kitchen, holding each other and holding space for the grief that was coming and the love that would remain after the grief passed. The next morning brought Dr. Martinez with news they'd been expecting but dreading. Mary had perhaps days, not weeks. The family gathered naturally, without formal summoning or dramatic announcements. Mark and Patricia came with the boys. Lucy arrived with her husband and daughter. David closed his auto shop and drove straight from work. Joe moved into their guest room to be closer to his sister-in-law, whom he'd been caring for since her husband died 16 years earlier. For 3 days, the house filled with the sounds of a family saying goodbye. Quiet conversations, shared memories, grandchildren playing in rooms where their grandmother could hear their laughter. Charles found his role in this tableau gradually and naturally. He wasn't the wealthy son-in-law anymore, or the successful businessman bringing resources to solve problems. He was simply Emma's husband and Mary's family, welcomed into the intimate process of letting go with the trust that had been earned over months of showing up consistently and authentically. On Thursday evening, Mary asked to speak with Charles and Emma together. "I need to tell you both something," she said, her voice weak but clear. "Emma, you gave up too much of yourself for this marriage, and Charles, you let her, because it was easier than examining what that sacrifice said about you." Both of them started to protest, but Mary held up a hand. "I'm not criticizing, I'm observing. But now you have a chance to start over, to build something real instead of something that just looks good." She looked at Emma. "Stop hiding who you are, sweetheart. You're worth loving exactly as you are." Then she turned to Charles. "And you learn to see the difference between what looks impressive and what actually matters. Emma doesn't need you to provide for her. She needs you to truly know her." Mary closed her eyes, tired from the effort of speaking. That's what real love is. Not finding someone perfect, but seeing someone completely and choosing to love what you see. That night, Mary Kowalski died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family photos and the sounds of people who loved her living their lives in the rooms nearby. And Charles Whitmore, who had spent his entire adult life measuring success in terms of acquisition and achievement, learned that the most valuable thing he'd ever gained was the ability to love his wife for exactly who she'd always been. 6 months later, Charles stood in the kitchen of their Lincoln Park brownstone, making coffee on a snowy February morning, and marveled at how different their home felt without actually changing much about its physical appearance. The difference was in the life it contained. Emma's laughter floated down from upstairs, where she was on the phone with Lucy, making plans for Sunday dinner. A tradition that had continued even after Mary's death brought the family closer together, rather than scattering them apart. In the living room, Mark's boys were sprawled on the floor playing video games, comfortable enough in their aunt and uncle's house to leave muddy shoes by the door and argue loudly about game strategies. David was at the kitchen table, helping Charles understand some basic car maintenance while waiting for Patricia to finish getting ready for their shopping trip. This wasn't the perfectly curated life Charles had once thought he wanted. It was better. It was real. "You know what I realized yesterday," Emma said, appearing in the kitchen doorway wearing jeans and one of Charles's old sweaters, an outfit she never would have worn during the early years of their marriage. "What's that?" "I can't remember the last time I pretended to be someone I'm not." Charles smiled, wrapping his arms around his wife. "How does it feel?" "Terrifying. Liberating. Right." The past 6 months had been a process of excavation, carefully removing layers of fiction to reveal the authentic marriage that had been buried underneath. It hadn't been easy. 12 years of learned behaviors and careful habits don't disappear overnight. But slowly they'd built something new on the foundation of truth Mary Kowalski had insisted they lay. Emma had returned to school to finish her art history degree, something she'd always wanted, but never felt she deserved. Charles had restructured his business to focus on ethical investing, working with companies that treated all their employees with dignity, regardless of their position on the organizational chart. More importantly, they'd learned to have conversations about money, about class, about the assumptions and privileges that had created the chasm between them in the first place. "I got a call from Joe yesterday," Emma said, settling into Charles's arms. "He wanted to know if we'd thought any more about the house." The house. Mary had left the Ashland Avenue property to Emma in her will, along with a letter suggesting that the young couple might find it useful as a weekend retreat or rental property. But Charles had a different idea. "What if we didn't rent it out?" he said. "What if we kept it as it is, a place for your family to gather, a place where kids from the neighborhood could come for after-school programs or tutoring?" Emma pulled back to look at him. "You mean like an actual community center? I mean like a living memorial to your mother, a place where families like yours can find the support they need." The idea had been forming in Charles's mind for weeks, inspired by stories Emma's siblings had told about their mother's unofficial role as neighborhood counselor, mediator, and problem solver. "Charles, that would be expensive to maintain." "I can afford it. We can afford it. And more importantly, it's the right thing to do." Emma searched his eyes, and Charles knew she was looking for signs of the old Charles, the man who made grand gestures to solve problems he didn't fully understand. But this wasn't a gesture. It was a commitment. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's do it." That afternoon they drove to the south side together, not as strangers navigating unfamiliar territory, but as partners planning their future. The house at 3247 South Ashland looked smaller than Charles remembered from his surveillance days, but it felt larger somehow, full of possibility instead of secrets. "You know what's funny?" Emma said, as they stood in Mary's old kitchen. "For years, I thought I had to choose between this world and your world. I never imagined we could create our own world that honored both." Charles looked at this woman who had sacrificed her identity for his comfort and who was now helping him discover his own authentic self. "I love you," he said. "The real you. All of you." "I love you too," Emma replied. "The real you. The one who's still learning how to be real." They stood together in the kitchen, where Mary Kowalski had raised 5 children on a construction worker's salary and taught them that dignity came from how you treated people, not how much money you had. Outside, the south side of Chicago continued its daily rhythm. Buses running their routes, children walking home from school, families building lives with whatever resources they had and whatever love they could share. And inside 3247 South Ashland, 2 people who had spent 12 years living a beautiful lie were finally learning how to live an imperfect truth. It wasn't the ending either of them had planned. It was better than that. It was a beginning.